Welcome to Talk South Asian to Me Season 2. My name is Michelle.
And my name is Anisha. Tune in every Thursday at 5 p.m. Central and hear us react to each other's stories about mental health and growing up in different South Asian households.
And remember, this podcast is not therapy. Engage with what feels entertaining and resonates with you and leave what doesn't.
Alrighty, let's get into our topic today. Today we're doing P. P4, topic reveal. Here we go. Perfectionism.
Perfectionism.
Yeah. So I thought today, like usual, we'll just start with a little bit of a definition, a background on what perfectionism is. We'll talk a little bit about how it shows up, what we can do about it, how it shows up in our South Asian communities, and then we'll get into stories.
Sounds good. I'm
All right, let's
excited
get into it.
get into this. Yeah, I know it's definitely a hot topic. Buzzword that we've heard around.
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty common. So I think this hopefully resonates with a lot of people.
Yes.
You might see yourself reflected in it to some degree. Not like you, just in general. You, our listeners, our audience.
Yes.
So what is it, right? Ultimately, perfectionism, how it's defined, is as a personality trait. And it's characterized by a tendency to set extremely high, rigid, or flawless goals and place excessive demands on oneself and others. Typically, perfectionists struggle with, low self-esteem and problems in like daily functioning because inevitably we make mistakes. We're human. And so when those happen, it can create a lot of dissonance. Yeah. Now, it's important to recognize again, perfectionism is a personality trait. It's not like a disorder. It's not like a mental health disease. It's just a personality trait. And people who exhibit perfectionist traits are more likely to develop certain, like mental health disorders, though. For example, like, depression or anxiety, sometimes even eating disorders. So there's a correlation there, but it's not characterized as a mental health disorder. Now, does any part of that definition of perfectionism like surprise you?
Not really. I think it kind of makes sense to me when you define it that way. It's kind of like my own definition.
Yeah, it shows up and it's talked about exactly as it is. The reason I ask is, I feel like a lot of the times these days, there are certain like buzzwords with mental health terms that what we think they mean and what they actually mean are very different. So I'm doing a little poll. But that is what most people think of when you think of perfectionism, right? Is you think of somebody who has high standards, essentially.
Yes. High expectations.
High expectations, right. Now, the thing that not quite surprised me, but the thing that was like, oh yeah, like a reminder for me was it's not just about high standards and high expectations for yourself. It can also be for other people in your life.
Expecting perfectionism from other people.
Expecting no mistakes from other people. Exactly.
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah. And, these standards, these high expectations, these high standards can show up really in any area of life, right? It can show up with athletic or artistic performances. It can show up in your career, affect your financial success. It can show up with, just general things around the house like organization, cleanliness, even timeliness. It can show up in like our physical appearance, how we dress, how we groom. It can show up with fitness and health. It can show up definitely within our relationships and our families. And it can even show up in like strict adherence to like moral or religious codes. Yeah. So it can really
aspects. Yeah.
Yeah. And someone can be perfectionist about like specific thing or multiple things, right? There's no exact way that it has to look. Everything's on a spectrum, right? So for some people it might be in like one area of life or in multitude of areas in their life.
That makes sense.
I think, and I think it's important to talk about this idea, right? Like we keep talking about the spectrum. So even with perfectionism, there is this spectrum. And on one end, right, there is a adaptive perfectionism, if you will, which is basically like all about striving for a high degree of success. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's adaptive, right? So that means like maybe more conscientiousness, more like organization, striving for excellence, very ambitious goals. That can still be pretty healthy. And, often it is linked to success, high self-esteem, happiness, even life satisfaction. But this healthy striving is what's like specific, right? It's the healthy striving.
Right.
It's not the unreasonable expectations. Yeah. So it basically means that you're still setting realistic expectations for yourself and you're allowing space for mistakes, like more growth mindset. Think of it like that.
Yes, that makes sense. I like the words growth mindset.
Yeah. I love growth mindset. I talk
Yeah.
about it all the time. It's like my favorite thing. On the other hand, on the other end of that spectrum, you have more maladaptive perfectionism, right? So this is kind of what we are talking about when we say perfectionism. It involves more of like this intense desire for someone's approval, unrealistic expectations, negative self-talk, pressure from others, the guilt, the fear, the very unhealthy side of perfectionism. And, usually, as you probably can imagine, that maladaptive perfectionism can be tied more to like low
Mhm.
confidence.
Yeah.
It's usually stemming from like fear of failure, fear of disappointment, fear of judgment, things like that. And that is often an indicator of like poor outcomes in relationship and overall like satisfaction and well-being.
That makes sense. I'm sure it's very highly related with people pleasing tendencies too.
Yeah.
Just like striving to be like the most perfect. Relate, like you said, it's in relationships as well, right? So trying to be the most perfect friend, perfect daughter,
Yeah.
perfect son, perfect sister, brother, sibling, right? Like perfect, all the relationships. And
All
having
the
to people
relationships.
please
Yeah.
to achieve those expectations.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And that's a good point, and I think the reason that these can seem so like similar, like the people pleasing and the perfectionism
Mm-hmm.
in terms of relationships is at the root of it, there's a fear there, right? So perfectionism and people pleasing come from a root fear of judgment, a fear of failure, a fear of something, right? Maybe even fear of disappointment, a fear of not being liked,
Mm,
whatever it is. So I think that fear that really ties those things together.
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk a little bit about like, okay, where does this really kind of come from? Like, how do people end up being perfectionists, right? So, research indicates that some of the factors may increase your likelihood for perfectionist traits and tendencies. And those
Mm-hmm.
factors are genetics,
Mm,
upbringing, and trauma. So, with genetics, there have been like twin studies done that have shown on both ends that it can be related to your genetics, but also environmental. So that's kind of cool. Upbringing. So what I mean by that is, having like high parental expectations, lots of parental pressure, very controlling parenting style,
mm,
very authoritarian,
yes.
do this my way just because I say so. Those kinds
Mm,
of upbringings can also be a factor for someone who has perfectionist traits and trauma. So perfectionist adults often report having experienced some kind of trauma, usually like abuse or neglect during childhood.
mm,
That
I didn't know that.
basically, yeah,
Yeah.
and like you can see how that would happen, right? Like if they experience some kind of abuse or neglect, particularly like emotional abuse or neglect, they might form these beliefs that they have to be perfect so that they can be loved and receive attention and blah 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 blah
Mm.
blah.
Oh,
Right?
wow.
So it's
That's
yeah, so
insightful.
it's easy to see how those kinds of childhood traumas, the way that we're raised, the parenting styles, the expectations placed on us
Mm,
can play a role in the thoughts that we have, the beliefs that we have that then pave the way towards perfectionist tendencies. Yeah. Let's see. So, something else I want to talk about is not just these kinds of factors, but what are the like cultural, social environments, cultures um,
okay.
that kind of foster having these tendencies, right? So we talked a little bit about growing up and genetics. Let's talk about environmental things for a moment. So some examples of environmental factors include like colleges and universities. So
Mm,
academic environments are often the factors that increase risk for maladaptive perfectionism, right? So
mm.
that competitiveness
Yeah,
essentially.
achieving that GPA or trying to get those credits done, those credit hours, getting that grade,
Mhm.
all the
Yep.
extracurriculars.
Oh yeah. Got to be that perfect student so that
Yes.
colleges want you. And then in
Yes.
college, you have to be the perfect student to
Hmm. Go
keep it
into
up
grad
and then go into
school,
job.
continue. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So research studies have found that there are three specific routes in school that particularly lend itself
Okay.
to perfectionism. Can you guess any one of those three?
No. Well, I'm trying to think. You said
Three types of like fields that you could go into in university that
Mm.
really indicate how highly likelihood there is of being prone to perfectionism.
Like maladaptive perfectionism.
Maladaptive perfectionism.
Is medicine one of them?
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yes. It's one of the number one culprits in the academic setting for people who come with perfectionist tendencies
Yeah.
or who develop it.
It's just so competitive. I know,
Yeah.
like just from the beginning stages, right?
Hmm.
Going into it, dipping our toes a little bit. I was like, whoa, this is insane.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of the other two. Law?
Yes. That's the
Okay.
second one. Bingo.
So this is in the order too, or no?
I don't know if they mentioned it in order, to be
Okay.
honest. They didn't say anything about order in the studies.
Okay. Third one. I don't know. Is it dentistry? No.
Close. I like that
Okay.
you thought a little bit from that perspective of it's medicine adjacent. Yeah, close.
Yeah.
It's not dentistry, but it is pharmacy.
Oh, pharmacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So they found that medicine, law, pharmacy are the fields that you can go into in colleges that are especially prone to perfectionism.
That's not really surprising to me, to be
Yeah.
honest. Just how competitive these fields are and learning about
Yeah.
people, like knowing people who are in these fields and how much stress they undergo and
Yeah.
how much competitiveness that they face.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Plus,
Hmm.
with like match, right?
Hmm.
You don't need to just be the best. You have to like, there's so many factors that go into
Right.
it that there's this almost like hopelessness of like, I have to be perfect in order to
Hmm.
make the cut. Because
Right.
just because you do medicine doesn't mean you're guaranteed a spot
Right.
to be a doctor.
Right.
Yeah.
It's lots of pressure.
Lots of pressure. Exactly. Other than colleges and universities in this environmental landscape, there's also athletics, right? You can
Mm.
imagine the same thing, very
Yes.
competitive,
Right. Striving
lots of
for
pressure.
perfect
Hmm.
games, perfect scores.
Exactly. And then there's arts, which again, similar to athletics, lots of pressure to be a certain way, to be
Hmm.
perceived in a certain way. So, same kind of brushstroke here. Then this one's not as surprising, but it's different than the ones we've been talking about, social media. So,
Social media.
specifically, social media as it relates to the perfectionist tendencies as it shows up for like body image.
Hmm.
Right. So it's a very visual platform, most social media, right? So
Hmm.
being able to have access to that and the way that we have access to it can sometimes create perfectionist tendencies of how we
Right.
should look. And then the last one, this one was interesting. It doesn't surprise me, but for some reason I was like, oh yeah, duh, is immigration, right? So like
Mm.
pressure to live up to parents' sacrifice, almost like this obligation to be perfect
Hmm.
because they've done so much for you.
Hmm. And being told to, like, I did so much for you. I came to this country, made
Yeah.
all these sacrifices, came into this country with $2 in my pocket,
Yeah.
So setting that, like, kind of those backhanded expectations are already there. And then kind of
Mhm.
taking that and using that as your expectations to strive for perfectionism can become maladaptive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we'll get into it a little bit later, but it's like you said, it's almost like expected. You're almost like
Hmm.
encouraged to have that perfectionist
Right.
mindset.
Right.
Yeah. Now we've been talking about, adaptive versus maladaptive perfectionism, but I also want to talk about like the three kinds of perfectionism that exist.
Okay.
So one is self-oriented. So just like it sounds, it's basically about placing excessively high demands on yourself,
Hmm.
self-oriented, right? So a self-oriented perfectionist would rely on like external achievements in order to feel satisfied, worthy, basically placing like external value
Hmm.
for internal satisfaction.
Yeah.
They're also more prone to like obsessive thinking and high levels of anxiety and worry.
That makes
Now the
sense.
second,
Yes.
yeah, that one makes sense. We're very
Right.
familiar with that one.
Hmm.
The second type is other oriented. So, what this means is this other oriented perfectionist will set high expectations on another person or people, usually like partners or kids, and then pressure
Okay.
them to fix their perceived flaws. Yeah. So,
So,
this one is characterized by a lot of like controlling behaviors basically in an attempt to like even if it's like a a well-intentioned attempt, an attempt to push
Right.
someone to be the best at what they do.
Okay.
Does that
So the
surprise
first one is like self, and the
you?
second one is kind of inflicting it on other people.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. And then the last one is socially prescribed. So what that means is basically it's referring to the perception that others expect you to be perfect.
Mm,
So it's still
yeah.
about you, but it's not coming from an internal pressure. It's almost seen as like a, this is what is expected of me from others. So like an external pressure,
It's like a perception. Like this is,
perception pressure.
yeah.
Yeah. 'Cause it's still
Yes.
internal. It's your
Right.
perception.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And this one is more about like internalized familial, societal, cultural expectations
Hmm.
more than their peers, right? So others may be influenced to, like develop perfectionist traits in a high
Yeah.
pressure environment, like a really competitive career, like medicine, for example,
Yeah.
like law, like we talked
Yeah.
about. Yeah. So there are three types of perfection, right? There is self oriented, other oriented, and socially prescribed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Self-oriented, other-oriented, and socially prescribed. Socially prescribed, when you first told me that, I immediately thought of like social media, which kind of makes sense in this style too, right? In this type, where if you see things on social media, it becomes a standard, some like beauty standards, and you kind of perceive that you need to strive for that, or can create that socially prescribed perfectionism for yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say social media is probably under the umbrella of socially
Mm-hmm.
prescribed
Mm-hmm.
perfectionism for sure. Yeah. So was any of that new to you? These three different kinds?
I mean, self is something I definitely was my go-to when I immediately think about perfectionism. The others inflicted, I think know of that idea, but it's nice to like have like a name
Name.
for it,
Yeah.
right? Where it's like thinking back to my own relationships where people are expecting me to be a certain perfect person for them, perfect relationship with them, and not being able to meet that, right? Again, that puts a name to that, right? It's inflicted on me. Same goes vice versa, right? Like me wanting my sister to be perfect a certain way, whatever I think that
Mhm.
is. So not fully a surprise, but it's good to learn that these have, this is a category for it. There's research behind it. There's these, this exists in the literature.
Yeah.
So
I've
exactly.
I've seen how all three of these kind of show up in like therapy clients, but I've
Mm-hmm.
never really like seen these as separate buckets. For me, they've just
Mm-hmm.
kind of all been under the same umbrella of
Yeah.
perfectionism. So it's kind of cool to see, like you said, right? There are very specific parts, avenues,
Right.
pathways
Right.
to this perfectionism.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Okay, so let's talk about signs of perfectionism. How do you even know
Okay.
you have perfectionism? What does that even look like?
Okay.
So I got a couple of different ideas to walk through. So here we go. First thing that I thought of was setting unattainable, unrealistic goals. We've been talking about that, right? High expectations,
Mm-hmm.
which means unreasonable goal setting,
Right.
which means you're setting yourself up for failing, which then
Mm-hmm.
perpetuates that cycle of perfectionism,
Right. That
right?
makes sense.
Yeah. Also being overly critical of yourself and
Mm-hmm.
others,
Mm-hmm.
not really creating any space to have any mistakes,
Right.
and maybe even expecting too much of other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? That's not helpful, and it's not great for the relationship, whatever relationship it is. Other signs of perfectionism can be like reliance on external measures of success, like grades,
Mm-hmm.
validate your identity, your self worth. And like we talked about earlier, there's a very big fear based element to this, right? So perfectionists tend to have their root in a fear of failure,
Mm-hmm. A fear of
sometimes even
rejection.
fear of
Mm-hmm.
rejection, even fear of judgment, fear of disapproval, fear of disappointment, fear
Mm-hmm.
of being unworthy.
Yeah. Fear of not being liked, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of that. Not being the
Yeah,
best.
exactly. And if you really want to change perfectionism from its root, I think figuring out what is your fear that's
Mm-hmm.
driving it can be helpful, because not everybody's going to have all the same fears, but
Right.
it is fear driven. So figuring out which fear is it for you. Maybe it's one,
Right.
maybe it's a couple, but being
Right.
able to really challenge those beliefs curiously
Mm-hmm.
and reframe them from a very growth mindset oriented place,
Mm-hmm.
that's really helpful in creating sustainable changes with
Mm-hmm.
overcoming perfectionism. This one was a little bit of a surprise, but also not. It was just kind of a reminder, I suppose. Another sign of perfectionism is procrastination and time management
Mm.
skills, right? So, the idea of like you're waiting for the perfect time to do something. Everything has to line. I
Mhm.
have to do this and this, and then I'll do that.
Yeah.
So perfectionism and procrastination sometimes go pretty hand in hand. Yeah. And this is something I get stuck in sometimes is the over planning, right? When you over plan something and then you just get caught in the weeds of it, you get caught in the details of it, can't get yourself
Yeah.
out to actually just do the thing, start the thing. I read in a very well article about procrastination where I got like the definition and everything, a really awesome quote I want to share. So the article talked about how fearing failure, as
Mhm.
procrastinators do. Wait, procrastinators, we're talking about perfectionism. Fearing failure as perfectionists do.
Mhm.
Perfectionists will sometimes worry so much about doing something imperfectly that they become immobilized and fail to do anything at all. This procrastination can lead to greater feelings of failure, further perpetuating a vicious and paralyzing cycle, right? Basically, the idea is that they kind of feed into one another, right? You have
Yes.
this fear of failing, you have this fear of it needing to not make any mistakes,
Mhm.
but then that fear feels so stifling and so like anxiety inducing that you just kind of want to put it off because you're just not ready to deal
Yeah.
with that. You're
You
not
just,
ready
like,
for that
freeze.
possibility.
Yeah, you just,
Yeah.
like,
And then you get
freeze.
stuck in it. It's a vicious cycle. Now, because of all of that, basically perfectionists are also likely to burn out pretty quickly. And they also operate from a very all or nothing mindset, which, I mean, that makes sense, right? It has to be perfect or no option. That's very all or
Yeah.
nothing. Like there's no
Right.
room for mistakes. They're also really, really, really focused on the results. They don't have any focus or any maybe like appreciation, we could say, for, the things that you learn along the way, the things that mistakes can often teach us, learning opportunities, right? And another thing that perfectionists do is they get really caught up in comparison, which can
Mhm.
be a really difficult thing to get out of. But it's important
Yeah.
to recognize, unless you're comparing to yourself, like your past self, any comparison that you do is an apples to oranges comparison. You
Yeah.
simply will not be able to compare in a way that's fair.
But it's so easy to,
Yeah.
right? It's so easy to, like, look at the person next to you in your class or at your work and be like, "Oh, they're doing this, but I'm not doing that. Or I'm doing this and they're not doing that."
Oh, yeah. And most of our like systems, like schooling and whatnot, they do set us up perfectly to compare with
Right.
other people. They
Right.
encourage that.
Yes.
It's just not helpful. But you can't escape it. It's
Mhm.
literally like pushed on you to compare
Mhm.
in
It's
one way
drilled
or the
into
other.
you ever since you were young, like in school.
Yeah.
Standardized tests, standardized systems that make you
Where do you
compare
fall in the
yourself to
rank?
other. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. Now, okay, we talk a lot about like science. Okay, what do we
Yes.
do with it, right? How do we overcome the perfectionism? So, because perfectionism is rooted in unrealistic goals, the opposite of that is to set realistic goals.
Yeah.
Be able to set bite sized, easily achievable, accomplishable goals
Mhm.
to kind of kick off the cobwebs of like, it has to be this way. And start by having small, achievable, like basically like SMART goals, right?
Yeah.
Specific, measurable,
Mhm.
attainable, realistic, and timely. Yeah. Also, it would be helpful to limit your time, like for a task, and like stick to it. Basically building time management skills,
Mhm.
right? Time blocking, essentially. And I really like this one. It's always terrifying for clients when I suggest it, but try new things.
Mhm.
Letting yourself fail at something new and appreciating how to learn your way through that process
Yeah.
can be really uncomfortable, but it's something that you don't know how to do, so you're going to be bad at it.
Mhm.
you
Like
know?
accepting that you're not
Yeah.
perfect.
And it gives you basically all these opportunities to start practicing acceptance,
Yeah.
start practicing growth mindset, which is why I love this particular activity, but most clients who struggle with this hate it, understandably.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Of course, practicing some kind of like mindfulness and like grounding exercises can be a really wonderful way because
Mhm.
a lot of perfectionist tendencies tend to put you a little bit more in anxious cycles and put you more into the future of like what ifs
Right.
and what ifs and what ifs. So being able to pull back, be present, ground yourself, be mindful,
Yeah.
that can be helpful to get out of that cycle.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
And like we talked about, growth mindset. It truly is the opposite of perfectionism, right? Perfectionism says, I can't make mistakes. Growth mindset says
Mm-hmm.
failures are stepping stones. They teach you something.
Yes. It's
Yeah,
okay to make mistakes. It's natural to make mistakes.
it's human. Are you a
Mm-hmm.
robot? No. You're going to make mistakes, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Even robots make mistakes sometimes.
Yes.
And the last one is more of a therapy thing, but I think it's really important to bring up that if you really, really struggle with CBT, struggle with perfectionism, something
Mm-hmm.
that's really helpful is CBT. So it's a therapy approach, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy. It's basically understanding that it's our thoughts that create our feelings
Right.
that indicate how we're going to behave. So if we want
Right.
to change how we behave, change up the
Thoughts.
perfectionism, procrastination, all of that, change the way
Mm-hmm.
we feel about it, that
Mm-hmm.
anxiety and that fear, we have to go back
Yeah.
to the root, which is our beliefs, our thoughts. So I have an example for that.
Okay.
So what that can look like, for example, when you're stuck in a perfectionism paralysis is you have the thought of, I can't make any mistakes on this. It has to be good. It has to be perfect the first time. That's going to make you feel anxious. It might make you feel
Mm-hmm.
dread. So what are you going to do about it? You're not going to want to start it. So you don't start it.
Right.
And you're going to keep
Yeah.
getting stuck in like, I'm going to plan it so that the plan is going to be perfect and I can just do it. And it's going to be great the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And it ends up keeping you stuck in the planning phase. Now with CBT, what it looks like to reframe this is, you can have that reframed thought of, I can make mistakes actually. I'm human. I'm going to make mistakes as a human. That's okay. Growth
Mm-hmm.
mindset, right? And then that feeling from that new thought, you might feel more like self-compassion, you might feel more acceptance, you might feel a little bit more relief. And so what will you do? You'll be able to move it forward,
Yeah.
right? You'll be able to actually do the thing and just make it like a rough draft so that you can revise it until you're
Exactly.
satisfied into whatever is like quote unquote good enough for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that was all my research on perfectionism. I keep wanting to say procrastination. They sound so similar.
They do. They
My
do.
brain is convinced it's on procrastination.
That is a good
Um,
another topic that we could do. It's
I
a good
think we
one.
did. Have we not? I feel like we
No,
have.
we did people pleasing for our last P.
We did time management, and
Oh,
that's
we
where we talked
did.
a little bit about procrastination.
Yes. Yes.
Mhm. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about like the South Asian connection. I'm really excited about this one in particular to talk about because
Okay.
I see this a lot with South Asian clients, and I have lots of thoughts on this. Let's dive in.
Okay.
Perfectionism is very abundantly existing in South Asian culture, and I want to break down.
Okay.
And I was looking at a couple of articles, to back myself up on all these observations that I have, and I
Mm-hmm.
think I found a couple that I really liked. There was a blog post by Repose, and there were two specific pieces of this that really stuck out to me that I want to talk about.
Okay.
One of them was that if you grew up with the pressure to do great in all you do, which
Mm-hmm.
is what most South Asians,
Right.
have that pressure. In addition to that messaging, we also receive this pressure to be model minorities, right?
Oh,
And
yes.
so with both of those pressures, there is a pull that we are told and that we feel internally to uphold this like reputation, this image of ourselves and
Mm-hmm.
for our family even,
Yeah.
right? So this meant, essentially that the things that concern anything to do with our future, like the university that we get into, getting married at the right time to the right person, being able to get like that perfect job or buying a house and like at what time are you buying a house, all those kinds
Mm-hmm.
of pressures, even like what car are you buying and like what kind of
Mm-hmm.
luxury car is it, like all of those
Yeah.
pressures feed into this idea we have to uphold a certain image.
Right.
And a
All
lot
about
of
the
this focus,
status. All about the
status,
status.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And a lot of this focus is surrounded on basically approval of others, not just like, our families, but even like extended family or even communities, essentially but what will people say? And that's why we have to
Mm-hmm.
uphold this image.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that those kinds of pressures, while they're running rampant in our
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
cultures, in our communities, there are consequences to that. And those
Yeah.
consequences are feeling inadequate, feeling
Mm-hmm.
like we're behind, feeling like we have to be perfect and have to
Right.
accomplish and fulfill all of those things in that image, or we feel like we're failing,
Mm-hmm.
feel like we're disappointing people. And basically, this article goes on to talk about how this whole like pressure system, this pressure cooker, it's created an intense need for perfectionism. where our grades dictated our self-worth, or getting into that special program meant that we would be seen, or maybe getting that award meant that you wouldn't have to handle criticism or negativity from those that you care about.
Yeah.
And this, at a young age, can teach us that so many things about ourselves might not actually resonate with us, that might not be our values, that might not be true,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we basically start navigating life from that place of fear,
Yeah.
right? Fear of not making it, fear of losing approval, fear of losing respect, likability, fear of not being enough, but fear of judgment.
Yeah.
It teaches us that in order to receive love, pride, maybe even respect, you have to earn it through
Mm-hmm.
perfection. And that as
Yes.
soon as we stop achieving, we are now unworthy.
And we've disappointed it. Like we haven't reached the status quo of the culture and the society and the community when we're not achieving or striving for that perfectionism.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think to continue to highlight this and add a little bit, there was another Psychology Today, yay,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Psychology Today article written by Angela Korath and Malia
Mm-hmm.
Khan. And this one is an extension, in a sense. I'm going to add a few things to what we've talked about, which is they continue to talk about collective mindset, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
another big facet of this. Collective
Right.
mindset views basically this individual as a representation of a larger group,
Okay.
right?
Right.
And that can create a recipe for an environment that's really stifling to share struggles, to be real, to seek help, because it
Mm-hmm.
basically fosters this idea that you as an individual are representing the entire community of people. So you have to be perfect. Otherwise, what are people going to say about the rest of the group? Yeah, that's a really great point. I never really thought about it like that. But
Yeah. It's like
and
that
that's
pressure,
important.
in addition to all the other pressures that you mentioned, is the pressure of representing your community or
Yeah.
the people around you. Like you said, the collectivist culture. You represent
Yeah.
the family name, right? Like all of that goes into it.
Exactly. Yeah. Like if you're struggling, if you don't accomplish these things, if you don't do your best and be your perfect self, then what does that say about your family? What does that say about your
Mm-hmm.
community?
Mm-hmm.
There's no separation of like, okay, this is just what they're going through. And maybe it's not
Right.
even a failing, but maybe it's just that they don't want the same
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it also, because, by that idea of, okay, then we're not allowed to be anything but perfect and we're not allowed to share our struggles. And what ends up happening is that now it's easy in those comparative moments where we're like, oh, okay, see, they are perfect.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't even know how much of a struggle they went through because, again, the system isn't set up to be able to share.
Yeah.
We feel a pressure not to share. So now when other people are perceiving you, they're going to see, oh, they're doing so well and they're so successful, but you may be on like day 300, day 500 of your journey. And
Yeah.
I, being on day one, I'm comparing myself now to you.
It's not
That's
fair.
not fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not.
It's not fair and it's not true. And it's just not a realistic comparison.
But it happens so much.
So much.
Yeah.
Exactly. In this article, they also talk about how there has been research in the US that has noted that there seems to be an aspect of ethnicity that contributes to the
Mm-hmm.
development of perfectionism. And they go to, the authors theorize that possible explanation for why that is may be that Asian American culture facilitates the development of perfectionism by harsher parenting styles,
Yes.
authoritarian style parenting
Right.
that is very ingrained in the Asian American culture,
Mm-hmm.
which is an emphasis also on like education and achievement. A very much like, oh, you got a 95, why didn't you get 100? The
Yeah.
constant strive to just be like, okay, be better, you can do better, keep going. But a healthy approach, for families is emphasizing that there is space to balance out areas of improvement and also recognizing the strength. There's
Right.
always going to be areas of growth, but we
Right.
don't need to fixate on that. And families can, I'm just hesitating to say should, so I will say
Mm-hmm.
can encourage this growth and the lessons learned rather than the idea of perfection and just reaching that goal, right? So basically, like it's about the journey, not the destination, right? And gentle comments about this difficulty of the task or appreciation of the effort or just even acknowledging that it's not easy to even strive for adaptive perfectionism,
Right.
that can go a long way into creating like a safe space for emotional well-being. So we
Mhm.
don't have to feel like we're sacrificing it or avoiding it, not being able to
Right.
acknowledge
Right.
it. Yeah. So that was my research a little bit into an observation into like how this shows up in the South Asian community. It's
Mhm.
very much rooted in the norms that we
Yeah.
set, the
It's
pressures that we set.
normalized. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
very normalized.
exactly. But like with everything we talk about, it's about finding that middle ground. It's about finding
Mhm.
that balance.
Mhm.
Obviously, there's always room for improvement. Obviously, someone's always
Right.
doing better than you. But
Yeah.
that doesn't have to mean anything about you other than, hey, do you want to go after that? Cool. Get started.
Mhm.
What is that going to look like for you?
Yeah.
Rather than it has to look like this, go get this, or otherwise XYZ. Yeah. Okay.
Well,
Well,
thank
that
you
was
for
my
that
research.
research. Thank you. I definitely learned some new things. Some
That's
things
good.
were validated too, what I felt and my observations and my thoughts. So this was helpful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Love to learn on this pod.
Mhm.
I love it when we teach each other new things. It's so fun.
Yes. Nice.
Okay, well, let me get into my story then. It's a pretty quick one.
Okay.
I just made a little bit of a reflection to think about how it shows up for me. I know that I have faced perfectionism issues in the past. I couldn't quite recall them. I think they were just too traumatic and I had to block them out of my
Mhm.
memory. But I don't remember exactly too much about it, but this is what I was able to remember. Essentially,
Okay.
I struggled on and off, but from what I can recall, most of my perfectionism had to do more with like creative pursuits. So things like writing, things like drawing and painting, things like
Mhm.
dancing. And how it showed up for me was over planning details. I'm a big planner.
Mhm.
And in my most maladaptive ways, I over plan and I get stuck on making like the perfect plan, the perfect detail, a perfect outline so that I can get
Mhm.
started. But what ends up happening is I get stuck in those
Mhm.
moments. I spend way too much time in those moments. Other ways that this perfectionism would show up for me, like artistic endeavors, was like fear of judgment, because I'm putting something creative out
Yeah.
there. So
Yeah.
it's almost like I'm putting a piece of me out there.
Mhm.
And that felt really
Mhm.
personal. So I feared a lot of judgment. I was a big procrastinator always up until very recently, very, very recently as a fully grown adult. And I've only very recently learned time management skills. So I struggle with those aspects of perfectionism too. And definitely, I think that there were times when I was overly focused on the result rather than like just
Mhm.
getting to enjoy the
Yeah.
experience of doing something. It
Yeah.
was almost like a rush to the end goal.
Mhm.
And, as we've been talking about, it's so easy to compare and like our educational systems like set us up, encourage
Right.
the comparison. So I definitely did a lot of that too. And it took a lot of unlearning as
Mhm.
an adult to get over that comparison and to really root myself in this growth mindset. But those are how it kind of showed up, at least from what I can remember and recall.
Mhm.
And I will say that overcoming it was not quick, was not easy. It took
Yeah.
time, it took effort, and it took
Yeah.
little moments that added up eventually, right? So
Right.
I learned to, like break first off my perceptions of how something should look. That is like the biggest thing. Even now,
Mhm.
that's something that really serves me is recognizing like in my mind, I say it has to look like this. For
Mhm.
example, the easiest example I can think of right now off the top of my head is I used to tell myself if I work out, it has to be in the morning and it has to be at this time. And if it's not, I'm not going to work out. It's too rigid. It's too all or nothing.
Right.
It's too
Right.
perfectionist, right? But when I could understand that and break that and say, I prefer to work out in the morning, but if I have to hit my third workout or fourth workout in, I really want to do it, I can go in the evening. I can. I'm able to, right?
Mhm.
But it's like that mental gymnastics that we do telling ourselves it has to look like something.
Right. Like the
So if we can get
plan.
out of our way from that,
Mhm.
better.
Right.
And that was a big part of it too, is like really understanding like how do I and how does my brain work and stop working against that and
Mhm.
start working with that. So
Right.
what I've been doing lately is I have a lot more responsibilities now and what I'm doing as a small business owner. So what I've been doing is week nights I read professional books.
Nice.
Weekend days and nights, I focus more on like doing more of the fun pursuits. Because if I
Yeah.
read or watch TV, like a new show, I'm a binger. It's
Mhm.
hard to break that habit. But I've
Yeah.
stopped trying to shame myself out of it and force myself to try. And I've just accepted, like, okay, this is how I can best structure this to work with me instead of
Right.
against me. Yeah. And I think another really big piece of what's been helpful is recognizing that I can focus on putting my most authentic foot forward. I
Mm-hmm.
don't need to put my best foot forward or my most
Right.
perfect foot forward. I find so much more happiness and calm and peace of mind in being authentic rather than being perfect.
Right.
It's too much
Right.
stress. I don't want it anymore.
And your authentic self doesn't have to be like that perfect self. Like it's
Yeah.
still your authentic. Your best doesn't have to
Yeah.
equal your perfect.
Yeah. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And I think a lot of this too was driven home for me because I worked with so many people who have perfectionist tendencies, and in helping them heal their patterns and break away from it and unlearn things, it almost served as like constant reminders to myself.
Yeah.
So in
That's
a
awesome.
way, healing with them was literally healing for me. So that was
That's
kind of a
amazing.
cool little
Yeah.
nugget that I noticed.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And working on like things like time management skills and growth
Mm-hmm.
mindset.
Yeah.
But that's my story. That's kind of what I've noticed. And it's interesting now that I think about it that I don't really have a very concrete recollection. My memory is not great in general, but I feel like I blocked it out too.
Yeah. And that's something that research does show. Like if there's something is really traumatic or takes up a lot of emotions in
Yeah.
your past, like in your childhood, we do tend to block it out.
Yeah,
But
we do.
it's really great to hear like how you're moving towards overcoming it and the behaviors that you're practicing to kind of raise awareness about your
Yeah.
perfectionism and how you can move past it, whatever that looks like. So that's amazing.
Whatever that looks like.
Yes. It could be
Small
something
step.
as simple as, setting boundaries like for yourself. I love the idea of giving your leisure time on the weekend and kind of having that boundary. Like, I'm not going to do professional and work reading over the weekend. This is my
Yep.
time, protected
I've
time.
accepted it. I know who I am.
But that's amazing. You're not because I feel that, and I'm not a small business owner, but I've heard from other people who are small business owners, like it can take up your 24/7 of your time and work kind of takes over your weekends too. And if you don't set that boundary and then perfectionism comes naturally,
Yeah.
right? And
Definitely.
so,
That's why I hustle during the weekdays. I'm like, weekends are mine. Nobody touch it.
yeah, that's really awesome though. I'm so proud of you that you're
We'll see how
finding
long I can
time.
hold out. We'll see. So far, it's okay.
Good. I'm proud of you. You can do it, but you don't have to be perfect at that either. We're not perfect, even when it comes to unlearning and undoing what has been drilled into our minds.
It's hard, but it
It
can be
is
done.
hard. It is hard. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you, darling.
Very admirable of how you navigate everything. So I look up to you about that.
That's sweet. But also remember, I'm nearly 30. It has taken me nearly 30 years of life to
And
get
that's
here.
okay. And that's okay. Better now than never, right?
True.
There's so many people older than us that make the same realizations. There's
True.
there's no there's no
And I
timeline
have
in
kind of a
this.
cheat code too, so it's like almost not fair. I'm a
Yes,
therapist, so
you
I
are a
have to
therapist
teach it. I have
and
to
you learn
be.
it. Yes.
I got a cheat
You got to
code.
practice what you preach, ma'am.
Exactly.
um so my reflection kind of goes into similar with you with your reflection. When I was first I tried not to also like do any research or go into detail when it came to coming up with my story. I just wanted to kind of write my take on it. And
Mhm.
this is just fresh in my mind. But as soon as I thought of perfectionism, the Inside Out 2 movie character, Riley, like her anxiety came up in my mind of how she was feeling really anxious to be the best, right, hockey player during tryouts and practice night and day, early morning, all the way to the point where her body was giving in to that anxiety attack, right? And I think that depiction, by the way, we love that movie. I know we've talked about it on the side. Like, definitely recommend it to our listeners to watch it. It's
Yes.
definitely made for adults too. And I love that psychologists and counselors contributed to creating this movie and the concepts in this movie. So it's so amazing. Loved it. I want to watch it again. That's how good it is. Uh, so good. And that's kind of immediately came into my mind, like that kind of depiction of how perfectionism and anxiety are so related. Like you mentioned earlier in your research too, right? They're correlated. And they kind of feed off of each other in a way, right? Like it's like a cycle. Like, you're aiming for perfectionism, and so your anxiety is building, right, to achieve those expectations, the unattainable attainable expectations. But then if you're not achieving that, perfectionism, because it's unattainable expectations, you feel more anxious. It's like a two-way, and they're intertwined. It's a cycle. So that's kind of what came into my mind at first, just like a picture of that. And then I was like, okay, like how and when have I felt like this? I was like, pretty much my whole life. That's like my first thought. I was like, yeah, like this literally, like until very recently, this is me in every aspect of my life. During my childhood and well into my adult years, I've always strived to be the perfect daughter, perfect sister, perfect student, perfect friend, and so on. And it was really, really easy for me to kind of strive and aim for that perfectionism, no matter how badly it affected my health. It affected my relationships. Like it was just like, I need to do this and I have to do this. Um, I think, and I think this is another part of the same as with you. It's a little bit like vague on where it's rooted and where it starts from. But I think what you talked about the South Asian relations with like the collectivist mindset, right? My parents immigrated. I want them to be proud of me. I think it's rooted in that, right? Like being the best, making them proud. And that equals me being perfect, being the perfect daughter, being the perfect student, bringing the perfect grades home, being the best I can. And I think partially also is from like striving for that attention. And I know I've talked about that, where my parents' attention was split between me and my sister, understandably under different circumstances. But I think my perfectionism was being reinforced from with their attention. And so when I would be perfect, right, quote unquote, in their eyes, I would get that love and praise. It was like a little bit of conditional. And so I think that's where it maybe have rooted from. I'm sure there's more when I dig into my therapy sessions more. But I think when thinking back, that's where it might have started. And it just became natural. Like that mindset was just normal. Like I didn't know any other mindset. Like I need to say yes to everything. I need to do volunteer service. I need to do extracurriculars. I need to do this. I need to do that. Like it just became a norm. And an example is like me staying up super late and barely getting any sleep to study and work extra hard on assignments, right? This meant doing all the chores in the house to make my parents happy on top of being a student, doing extracurriculars, being in student council, becoming like an officer for extracurriculars, right? All of the above. This looked like me. It came up as me sacrificing self-care and rest to spend maximum amount of time with my friends, to be that perfect friend, right? Giving up my time to rest or relax or do my own hobbies to like make my friends happy. So I know like a lot of this like resonates and relates with people pleasing, but it really was like striving for like perfectionism. That's why I was doing all these things. Anything that was requested of me by adults, elders in the family to help them, no matter how much it affected my schoolwork, or if they need an extra set of hands to get ready for a gathering, like I would always say yes, whether I had an exam or not, right? Like all of that, thinking that it would help me be this perfect person. Lots of it was self-oriented as well, like you said, like very internal as well. Like most of it was socially prescribed, right? What I've been describing, like how I want to be perfect socially, but it was internal too, right? Like the mindset was, if I'm perfect, then I'll feel good about myself, or I'll get that external attention, but then I internally will feel good about myself. Or it was a little bit, like you said, it's a little bit related too, right? In order to be the perfect student that I want to be, I have to be perfect at my grades and studying. Like it's very internal as well, like setting those high expectations. I would go to lengths to be this perfect person, and the praise and attention I received in return, right, fueled me. This mindset continued for a really long time, probably well past college, until very recently, and then like I talked about it contributed to my anxiety. It wasn't until in my mid-20s I realized that this was not normal. In one of my therapy sessions, my therapist said, and this is not an exact quote, but I do remember this. She said that I am allowed to make space for my own needs. And like, I was like, what? At first I was like, I don't have any needs. Like, what? And then I was like, after some exploration, I learned that I was just suppressing my needs, right? I was suppressing my other emotions, just like Inside Out too. Spoilers, I should have said that first, but
Would must have been.
yes, go see it if you haven't. But I was suppressing my needs, that would fulfill my other emotions, right? My need to recharge, my need to practice my own hobbies, just time for myself. And so when I started exploring that and I was like, okay, what are my needs and, how can I make time for them and make space for them? It felt wrong and weird. And it felt like I was moving away from perfectionism because I was making space for myself. It's important to understand, right, that perfectionism is very idealistic, like you mentioned, right? Unattainable expectations. And I remember my therapist saying, like, progress over perfection. Like, that quote will always stick with me. Like, progress over perfection. Like, if I'm moving in the right direction to be a good daughter, to be a good sister, to be the best person I can be, even though I'm not perfect, I am making progress. I am moving in the right direction. So, like, that really stuck with me. That quote, like, progress over perfection really helped me move away from perfectionism. When I would kind of question myself and say, like, or if I would be at a point in my life where I'm like, okay, do I really need to say yes to this volunteer opportunity at work? Or do I need to, like, protect my time, extra time that I have at work to, like, take the lunch break that I deserve versus doing that work for the volunteer thing? Right. And so, and then when I switched my mindset to, like, progress over perfectionism in that same situation, I was like, oh, look at all the other progress, like all the other volunteer things I'm doing. Let's look at that. Why do I need to add another thing? Right. I'm still making progress towards the right direction. So that was, like, really helpful. Um, and then during this process, there was still that fear, right? Like we talked about, like you mentioned, there's perfectionism has a lot of fear behind it and underneath it. So a lot of it was like the fear of rejection for me, fear of judgment, fear of disappointment. And that kind of came up too when I was exploring all this in my therapy sessions, that I feared that if I didn't fit the perfect roles I had developed in my life, no one would love me and I would be rejected. So realizing that I shared this mindset was really profound. And I kept on asking myself, like, where did this all started? And I know we, like, talked about how it's idolized in the community, right? Perfectionism, it's even encouraged, right? It's like you need to be perfect to make your parents proud and make their move worth it or their sacrifices worth it, whether that included high academic expectations or being talked about in the community as the person who can do it all, right? Which is really toxic and unhealthy. I don't know if I don't know if this was Brown Girl Therapy or, like, you posted this, I can't remember, but it was like, maybe it was you, that you don't owe your parents, like, it was you, right? Like, you don't owe your parents for taking care of you. Like, you don't need to live your life for them. Like,
You
they're
did not ask to be born.
right.
That's how I phrased
That's how you phrased it. And so a lot of that perfectionism is related to pleasing the parents and making, like,
the obligation.
right, acknowledging that they did make the move for us, right? Those words, like, I made this move for you, for better opportunity, for education, like, you need to do better in school, you need to do this, you need to do that, like, I want you to do this, like, all the perfectionism expectations. But like you said, you were not you weren't, it was not your control for you to be born, right, in this family. And it was not in your control to make this move, right? All these choices that were made by your parents or people who raised you, it's not your responsibility to repay them for that, whether that looks like perfectionism or whatever that looks like. It's not your responsibility.
You can do it if you want to do it,
Right.
but don't do that out of motivation.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not fair to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's not fair to ask of anyone.
Yes. So progress over perfectionism, good takeaway for me. And other people's choices and reactions are not your responsibility, period.
Progress over perfection reminds me of, that quote that I was talking about a while back that I was obsessed with? My fitness coach said it to me. She said, always something mindset.
Right.
That was huge for me. I didn't even realize I had some all or nothing thoughts, but with the thoughts that are all or nothing for me, the always something mindset was huge in breaking out of it has to look a certain way.
Right.
These little sayings are, like, cute and fun, and they're a little bit cliched, but they're cliched because they're so true.
Yeah. And it sounds cliche because it sounds unrealistic because it's not normalized. You're like, oh, like, that's just a saying. Like, that's not normal. Yeah. That's not realistic, but it is. It is realistic. So you were brainwashed.
It's more realistic.
You were brainwashed. Yeah, you need to get unbrainwashed.
Take the pill, or is it don't take the pill?
But it's
Yeah.
true, right? Like when we hear these cliche things, it just feels so fetched. Like it's just cliche and it's not. But these little sayings can be real and they are very applicable with what we're dealing with. And I love that you brought up procrastination related to perfectionism. We were talking about the topic and you brought up both in conjunction. I was like, what? How are they related? But then like hearing you talk about how they're related, I was like, oh my gosh, this is me falling asleep on the couch because I feel so pressured about all the things I need to do. And instead of doing it, I'll just sleep. Hey, like that's how my procrastination looks like. But I never thought about them being related to each other.
It seems like the opposite at first glance, right? You would think if your goal is perfectionism, why would you procrastinate? You'd want to like get in there and get it done. But it's that overwhelming pressure that makes you procrastinate and anxiety. Yeah.
And it's so like, awesome. And like you mentioned, because of that collective mindset of how much perfectionism is encouraged and it like praised and positively reinforced, like this is definitely one thing I would say like it's probably really challenging to unlearn and move away from because it requires you to have an individualistic mindset and kind of unlearn and remove yourself from that collective mindset. So like you mentioned, it's not an overnight thing. It takes time. We're all in the same boat.
This was a good topic. I really enjoyed today's learnings and our stories. And you know, I have to say, like when I think of like our early friendship, you know, in high school, I have this, I don't know what class this was, but I have this one specific image of you seared into my mind when I think of high school Michelle.
What is this?
And it was outside one of our classes, and I cannot remember which one, but I'm fairly certain it was our senior year or junior year because we were talking about colleges around that time. And I just remember this image of you having walked outside of this classroom and you have like, you're carrying a bunch of like, you know, books, right? And you just look.
My JanSport giant backpack still also.
Yeah, and you got your JanSport backpack and a bunch of, you know, still books in your hand. And you just look so like, I don't know, like you just stressed. Look like you have the weight of the world on you,
like literally. Stressed.
And my memory of you at that time, frozen in that moment, is very much you're caught between so many different thoughts in your brain that you're kind of like, okay, which one do I give time to right now this minute? Okay, I'm trying to be present, but I'm also pulled in all these directions. And I mean, that's the Michelle from high school that I have seared into my brain when I think about all of these moments where we reminisce about how we were and like what we've learned. Is that's the Michelle that I see. And I just want to like, I want to like drop her books and give her a freaking big hug and be like, girl, it's okay.
I know, it's crazy. As an 11th grade student, I took an AP chemistry class that was full of seniors. Isn't that crazy?
Yes, it is.
Like,
yes,
I think me and like 2 other students were juniors. The rest were seniors. And that was my idea of perfectionism. I just had to be the best student and do the best things. Go to all the office hours.
Yeah. Well, that's true. But you are the best, not because you're a perfectionist in any one area, but because you're so loving and sweet and caring and thoughtful. And
I like to say I'm my best self, my best authentic self.
Exactly. Love you. And that's the version of you I love and appreciate and cherish.
Love you too.
You're amazing. I love amazing. You don't have to be perfect. Be authentic.
Yes.
This was a fun topic. I loved it. It almost felt a little bit of inner child healing in our conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love the little Inside Out reference just because it's so good. I want to watch it again when it comes on Disney Plus.
I literally keep telling all of my clients, I keep telling all of my family, I'm telling all of the people everywhere, I'm like, go watch Inside Out. Yes. It's so good.
So good.
And
so
it's
good.
so relatable, this one more than the last one, because it's primarily centered on anxiety. And which adult doesn't have anxiety from time to time?
Yes. It's a normal emotion.
Great. Yeah. And the depiction of anxiety in this is amazing. Visual representation of what sometimes it's hard to describe if we're disconnected from our emotions. Just go watch it, guys. Just go watch it.
We can probably do a whole episode on this.
Actually, yeah, we probably could.
All right. Well, our wonderful listeners, if anything resonated with you, or if you would like to share any thoughts, feedback, comments, you can reach us at our email, which is talksouthasiantome@gmail.com, and our socials, which is the handle at talksouthasiantome. Be sure to subscribe to our Spotify and our YouTube, and like and comment as well. All right.
Catch you all in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.